Well, good afternoon, church. It is great to be with you this afternoon. Well, what am I saying? I'm recording this the afternoon. It is Sunday morning, and today is your Bible class, the last Bible class that I will be recording in this little series of, well, just me kind of piddling around about in Bible history timelines. Really excited to get to join you in your living room or wherever you're watching this, and looking forward to the day that we're back together and getting to talk to one another face to face. It is an interesting thing talking to a wall or a screen. And I'm kind of quite ready to get to enjoy one another's company in person. But here we are, and this gives me the opportunity to talk about one of the things that I'm most passionate about, most interested in, which is Bible history. Reason being, if you missed last week, we sort of hopped through the Old Testament timeline. But I wanted to talk just a second before we hop into this New Testament timeline of why I care about the Bible history. The first reason that I care about Bible history is because the Bible claims to be a historical book. It doesn't, and our faith in Christ in particular is not rooted in blind I don't know, blind acquisition to the fact that it happened. We believe, based on the evidence of witnesses, that Jesus is who he says he was. We believe that these are recorded events that we find in Scripture that can be attested to and that are supported by the historical record. Now, we don't mean that we have to verify every last detail to the nth degree of certainty. Anyone who has done any kind of work in history or studying history will very well know that certainty is not something that the historical record can give us. Every place where we have any kind of record of history, there is a person behind the pen, and that person has an agenda when they're writing the history. And even the most unbiased of people, they have a worldview, and it clouds what they are writing and what they're choosing to write and what they choose to leave out. And typically, hopefully, we can have multiple sources so we can get a picture of the idea of what's going on, but that's just not always the case. And so a lot of the times, the only records that are available is one or maybe two sources, and we have to either make the idea of, well, we can trust this to a degree or we can't. And that's not just with biblical history, that's all of history in general. As far as records before around around 7 or 800 BC, you basically have one source, and it's Herodotus, and he just wrote about everything that happened in the past, and you can cross-reference that with some of the archaeological finds in Egypt, but it's not like there's multiple historians talking about what the ancient world looked like. You just have to say, well, we can either trust Herodotus, or we cannot trust Herodotus, or we can try to find some way of sort of trusting him. And the same is true of pretty much every historian in the ancient world. There are just periods of history where we have a lot of data and periods of history where we don't have a lot of data. The thing that I love the most about learning about all this historical data is that it helps me to understand the scriptures better. I'm not really looking for, ooh, let me find this little piece of history and then I can believe my Bible. No, I believe that the scripture is kind of, it is the normative source. I trust it to be true. But what I do really love about the historical record is that it helps me to understand what the biblical authors are saying, because each one of the biblical authors live in a world that is different than ours. And they have different norms, and they have different customs, different ways of writing, different ways of using words. And they are writing to people in their times and places. So the more I know about those times and places, the more I can see and get my head around what the biblical authors are writing. And that helps me understand my Bible better, which is something that I think is really helpful. And I think we'll see today with the New Testament how there's some stuff that his history can really give us a good grasp, especially when it comes to Jesus's ministry. So with that, we're going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen, and we are going back to start any sort of New Testament timeline. Oh, that's the wrong screen. Let's see. Hold on. Let's see. New share. Yep. Okay, that's the one. Yes, actually, that's the one. Okay, so to start any sort of New Testament timeline, we really do need to um, start before Jesus's birth. So Jesus was born in around 5 or 6 BC. In the Middle Ages, the Christendom, the Catholic Church, combined with all the princes of Europe, and they wanted to redo the calendar and set the calendar based on Jesus's birth. And so they got some nice monks to try to redo all of that calendar. They did their best, and they got pretty close to when Jesus was born being the turn of the times. They got it at, they put it at zero AD, BC, whatever zero is. Your math people can tell me. They missed it just a little bit. And there's a reason why we know they missed it, because Herod, we are sure, Herod the Great died in 4 BC. And Jesus was alive when Herod was alive. So Jesus could not have been born in 0 AD or 1 AD. He had to have been born in probably around 5 BC, maybe 6, because Herod said, kill all the boys under 2 years old. So if you backtrack the dates, maybe 6 or 4, depending. So this timeline has it at 4 BC. That's it's somewhere around there. Again, as we talked about last week, this period of time, we know a lot more about the dates, but we don't know everything. So we need to start not with Jesus's birth. We need to start before Jesus's birth, because we need to understand about the world that Jesus was born into. If you look here, we talked about last week the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. In Daniel, there's this cool, in the weird part of Daniel that's not read in Sunday schools, the visions in the night and the beast, there's this talk about this great beast with a horn that's going to trample the world, and then the horn breaks into 4 horns. Well, that's Alexander the Great. He's the great beast, and then he breaks into his 4 generals who take over the known world afterwards. Ptolemy controls Israel first, and then Seleucus, and then there's the Maccabean revolt, where Judas Maccabeus, a priest, takes over control, and that family reigns for a brief, about 100 years, and then the Romans come in. Some descendants are fighting over the Maccabean throne, and 2 brothers try to get the Romans to help them out, and the Romans say, sure, invite us in, we'll help you out, we'll settle it for you, and they took over. I think it's quite interesting, and a very important thing is that Pompey the Great was the one who annexed Judea, is what it was now called, in the Roman province. But then a very important event happened about 13 years later. During this period, the 63 BC to about, from 63 to about 20 BC, Rome experienced the greatest period of turbulence in the height of its power. This is where Julius Caesar takes over and becomes the first, sort of the first emperor. Really, the first emperor is Augustus, his adopted son, but he is the one who broke the Republic. This is the death of the Republic. And Pompey and Julius Caesar and a guy named Crassus formed what was called the First Triumvirate. And they were the most powerful dudes in Rome. They were bossing the whole empire, which was a massive empire at this point. I won't bore you with all of the Roman history. It's something that I think is important to learn, but not 100% at this point. But basically, Julius Caesar ended up being pitted. Crassus got himself killed, and then Julius Caesar and Pompey were fighting each other for supremacy over the Roman Republic. Now, Pompey was defending the senators, and Julius Caesar was the aggressor, and there was all sorts of political showmanship or whatever, but really it was Pompey versus Caesar, and Caesar won. Pompey's space of power was in the east. It's where a lot of his stuff was. So he fled to the east when he was fleeing Julius Caesar, and he went to Egypt. And the Egyptians saw the writing on the wall and said, hey, let's go ahead and kill this Pompey guy, and then Caesar will like us. That was a big mistake. Caesar loved showing mercy to his enemies. It really, he would be all magnanimous. Oh, I cleanse you of your sin. It's okay. I'm a good dude. Just pay homage and we're good. And so he was really mad, or at least it was reported he was really mad. I bet he was actually mad because, I don't know, that makes sense with his character. And so he came into Egypt and was really ticked off at the people in charge of Egypt. But he really wanted to annex Egypt into the empire because Egypt was the most it was until later the most fertile land in the world, and eventually Egypt became the key to feeding Rome. The Nile constantly brings in silt, and it's very fertile soil, and they can grow tons of crops. And so Caesar starts this little decides to settle a dispute between Cleopatra and her little brother over who gets the throne. And he sided with Cleopatra, and all of the noble people in Egypt sided with her brother. Now, Julius Caesar got himself into a little pinch because it was Julius Caesar and, like, I don't know, a few hundred of his men who were trapped in the imperial citadel with Cleopatra. And then the entire Egyptian army surrounded them with these noblemen. And so Caesar, being a very good general, was like holding out, but he was in a real pickle because he was away from his main base of support and everything like that. And it could have gone pretty badly for him. Well, there was this guy who is an Edomite, one of the children of Esau, who eventually they became to be called the Idumeans, who realized that he had an opportunity. And he got a band of people together and led a forced march overnight, and he knocked out the Egyptians and rescued Caesar. And this guy's name was Antipater. And Julius Caesar, who always paid his debts and was a good patron, said, "Wow, thank you, I appreciate that a lot. You go ahead and take all of Judea and reign over it." Antipater was Herod's dad. And so that is what started the Herodian dynasty. With Antipater's opportunism, this is what allowed the Herod the Great to rise to power. So this was, I can't remember the exact date, but it was about 10 years before Herod took over. So 30, we'll call it 47 BC, maybe 49, if I remember rightly, because the Ides of March, it's okay. So this is what brought Herod to the throne. Herod features heavily in the gospel accounts. It's not Herod the Great, but Herod's sons. But the Herodian family was such a powerful thing. And if you've ever been to Israel, seen the Temple Mount, you see Herod's hands all over the Holy Land. His architecture is some of the greatest in the ancient world, maybe the greatest in the ancient world. Herod was a visionary builder. He was, as it says here, he controlled the spice trade. He was one of the wealthiest men alive of his day. He was a visionary builder and innovator. This Herod was an incredibly impressive individual as far as architecture and all of those things go. As far as a good person, he was an awful person. There was a joke that Caesar Augustus said about Herod, because they were contemporaries. He said that it was safer to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons, because Herod pretended to keep kosher. He sometimes did, and so he didn't eat pigs, but he would murder his sons because he went insane and crazy. This is the Herodian dynasty. After Herod died in 4 BC, actually we have to talk about that for a minute, because in 4 BC Herod died, and he had 4 sons, and he wanted Aristobulus, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip to divide the land among them. Well, whenever Herod died, the zealots up in the Galilee, the Pharisees and the zealots up in the Galilee, decided that they were going to try again on the whole independent rule thing. And they were going to follow in the footsteps of Judas Maccabeus and fight a war to kick out the invaders and go back to purity to God. And so the Romans in 4 BC had to march in a legion into the Galilee, which is, again, Jesus' hometown. This is where his stomping grounds are. And Josephus tells us that the Galilee ran red with blood. And so around the time of Jesus' birth, a little bit afterwards, while Jesus was in Egypt, everyone in the Galilee lost a family member, probably, to the Romans. Now, I tell you that because that should give you some idea of what a good, God-loving Jew was dealing with. They were dealing with an oppressive government that would kill them for rebelling, and rulers who were bloodthirsty and evil and vain and all sorts of horrible things. So that it kind of just helps you get some context over whenever you have people trying to get Jesus to be a conquering Messiah. You can definitely understand a people who have been massacred by the Romans and massacred by Herod and massacred by all sorts of people, why they would want some kind of political leader who would protect them and lead them to having some independence so that they can do what's right. Because The world was not in a good way for them. But anyways, Herod the Great had these 4 sons, and eventually these 4 sons did take over the rule. Herod Antipas is the one who we see the most in the gospel accounts. He's the one who lives right up there. It's in a city called Tiberias, is where his main place was, which is within a day or two's walk of Nazareth. It's this guy was in control of Jesus's area. He's the one who put John the Baptist to death. Herod Philip, Caesarea Philippi was built by Herod Philip, and this is where Peter declared Jesus was Messiah. It's over there right by the Mount Hermon, the mountain of transfiguration. And Archelaus is mentioned in Matthew 2:22 as the reason why Jesus went to Nazareth rather than going back to Bethlehem, because Archelaus was the worst of all of them, eventually removed by the Romans. Now, Aristobulus doesn't really appear in the gospel story at all, but he did have 2 sons who appeared a lot in Acts. So whenever you hear of Herod in Acts, we see every single Acts reference except for Acts 4:27 and 13:1 refers to Herod Agrippa the first. So Herod Agrippa was also, Herod Agrippa II, it's actually very cool. His son, they say that he became a devout and observant Jew, and Paul appeals to this in his speech to him. So just think about this is the Acts Herods. This right here, these are going to be, this one right here is mostly the gospel Herods, and then Herod the Great looms large over this all. But I hope that gives you just a bit of an idea of the world that Jesus lived in. Let me show you real quick just how the breakdown of the world that Jesus lived in looked like. This is the Galilee right here. These are political districts. So this is how Rome collected taxes. This is the Decapolis. This stretches up, is very important. Direct Roman rule right here in the Decapolis. They had big plans for the Decapolis of building cities and showing the might of Rome on the eastern edge of the world. This is Batanea, which is where Herod Philip reigned. This purple right here is where Herod Antipas reigned. Archelaus took over pink for a while. And then, so these are kind of the political districts. It's very interesting. Capernaum is right here in between 2 political districts. So we see a lot of tax collectors that Jesus called in his ministry. Well, it makes sense that once you cross from one region to the other, you're going to have to pay taxes. That's, that much is the same today as it was ever. And so this is the whole Sea of Galilee world, which is really interesting because this area is mostly religious Jews. We find lots of synagogues, and lots of the historical record tells us this is a pretty devout area. The Decapolis is very Greek, very much pagan, the bad place. A religious Jew would not go here. This is the other side. This is a far country. When it talks about the prodigal son, if you just go over here, this is as far as you can get theologically from over here. And then this is also somewhere in between, but more on the pagan side of things, more worldly. This is kind of where your good, devout Pharisees would take over, as well as all of the kind of common folk who went that way. Down here in Judea, this is where Jerusalem is. And Jerusalem was in the charge of the Sadducees. It's their base of power. If you remember, Judas Maccabeus was a priest, and so the priesthood gained lots of political power. When Poppy took over, when Rome takes over, they don't want to unmake the wheel. They just want you to pay your taxes. And so the Sadducees maintained power, and they just became basically Roman agents who were sort of the mediators between Rome and Israel, but also enriched themselves off of the Roman conquest, which is why they were very hated. Pharisees who were up here, Pharisees and Zealots, they're similar. Many Pharisees were not violent people. It kind of depended on your interpretation of the law. And so there were 2 guys, Hillel and Shammai, who were very prominent Pharisees. They were kind of the 2 schools of thought. Hillel was much less, he was more against, love the Romans, love your neighbor, all of that stuff, kind of what Jesus taught, which was mostly non-resistance and loving people and letting God decide ultimately. And then a guy named Shammai, he was more of the well, sometimes we have to help God to get his will done. So let's go ahead and fight that revolution. And the Zealots really kind of took over um, they took after Shammai. And so we see those two groups of people represented, and Jesus kind of deals with all of those concepts as you're reading the Gospels. You can look at that. But so that kind of leads us into Jesus's day, and I want to just take a look at a timeline of the Gospels. I think it'll help us to not of the Gospels, of the New Testament. This is, so we have Jesus's birth around here in 4. We have Paul and his so the way that this breaks it out is it makes a comment on when Paul wrote each of these letters. So these are the letters of Paul: Galatians, the Thessalonians, Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And if you notice, your New Testament's actually organized based on who wrote the book and then the descending order of length. So you have the Gospels, and then you have Acts, and that's like the history thing. And then once you get into the epistles, it's Paul's letters, and it starts with the longest and ends with the shortest. So Romans is the longest, and Philemon's the shortest. And then they group the Thessalonians and the Corinthians together. This is a pretty good guess at when each of the letters were written. So this has Galatians put around between 40 and 50, probably closer to 50. A lot of people think that either Galatians or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were the first letters written of Paul. You look at internal evidence and a lot of other factors, and you try to piece together, what's going on. It makes sense. We know Galatians was written at least 15 years after Paul's conversion, which was around 30-ish, maybe a little later, 33, depending on when Jesus was crucified. And we don't know. We know it was after 27. We know it was before 33, but we're not 100% sure exactly where it falls there. But anyways, we know it's after 27 because that's when Pilate took over. So if Pilate was the consul then, or the governor, then we know that it was after 27. But anyways, so we have, and James is definitely considered one of the earlier letters as well. So we're not going to know exactly when. Paul, unfortunately, didn't write a date and timestamp, but I do think that it can be helpful for us to see. This kind of shows the period in which the history covers. So just before 0 AD all the way up to 30-ish. So this is where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John cover. And then this is the period that Acts covers. Acts starts AD 30 and it extends about 63. So something like that, 63, 64. Somewhere around there. We know that because there was a massive persecution of Christians that happened around 64 AD, and that's not mentioned in the book of Acts. And so you would think that if they were in Rome and a big persecution of Christians broke out in Rome, it would have been commented on by Luke. So we can be pretty confident that it finished up its account somewhere around 63. Big event right here in AD. What is it? When was the destruction? It's 70. My mind is blanking right now. I believe it's AD 70. Here we go. Google always has your back whenever you can't think of an exact date. And this one's an important one, and I'm almost certain it's 70 AD. Okay, I was right. So 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. So remember, we talked about in 4, there was a revolt. There was another minor revolt early on around this area. You can see from a picture, from reading the Gospels and everything, that Judea was a powder keg, and it was just waiting to be lit because Rome was very pagan. They worshiped many gods. They had very many images of their gods, and they were very, very much they're very much fans of lots of money, lots of power, lots of violence, and lots of lust, and multiple wives, and all sorts of deviant sexual practices. All of those things were not only, they were not just tolerated, they were encouraged for the most part. And so Rome and the Hellenistic worldview that is behind Rome Rome were the victors and the emperors, but not because they were very unique as a people. It's because they were the best outsourcers ever. Anytime they came up against an army that was better than them, they would copy their tactics and then beat them. That's how Rome became as great as they were. They went to Greek culture and they're like, oh, you guys have some good cultural and thinking stuff. We'll just adopt that and keep rolling. They were incredible, incredible outsourcers and the chief of pragmatists. So that was Rome. And Judea were a bunch of backwards hillbillies who were just incessant that God spoke to them and that mattered. And they were going to hold on to that no matter what, because when they were exiled from the land, they held on to God and God brought them back. And that happened. And they were a people because God was their God. And their people got thrown out of the land because they made common course with people like the Romans, because they accepted all of the practices of the nations around them. And so everything went wrong. And only whenever they turned their hearts back to God did God bring them out of exile. And so they were not doing that again. You can read that in Ezra and Nehemiah. They were going all the way for God. And this was huge to so many people in Judea. And even if the rulers, even if the Herods of the world, and even if the Sadducees and some of the wealthier Pharisees, most of the Pharisees weren't at all. Jesus' problem with the Pharisees weren't that they were corrupt. Most of them were, well, some of them were. He did have some problems with the rich Pharisees. So yeah, so there's some corrupt, even if the powerful were corrupt, the people weren't writ large. And I think that we read in the Gospels that so many people were flocking to Jesus and ready and willing. You know, Jesus came because the time was right. This is something that I think is really true, is that, and it holds true throughout most of history, that, you know, the people in power are often the people who are the most evil, and the everyday common people are different. But we're controlled in large part by our rulers. It matters who's in charge. And but regardless, I say all of that because I'm trying to explain that Judea was a powder keg, and eventually, and Jesus prophesied that this would happen, that eventually the temple would be torn down and not one stone would be thrown upon another. Because in part, and Jesus says, because they didn't recognize the times, they didn't recognize that he had come to them. And so Jesus, it's not, had they seen the Messiah when he was there, they wouldn't have tried to fight and create another corrupt kingdom of man. They would have seen that Jesus was bringing the kingdom of God, a kingdom that doesn't come through power and violence, but a kingdom that comes through love and self-sacrifice, a kingdom that comes through taking suffering on ourselves rather than inflicting it on others. That's the kingdom that Jesus was bringing. And they missed that. And because they missed that, as righteous as they were trying to be, they went into disaster. And that's why Jesus wept. He wept over Jerusalem when he went into it. And he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stone the prophets, how I long to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing. And man, it's I can feel that. I can feel Jesus's pain, because the more that I've seen the lives that these people have lived and the oppression that they were under, I so understand the anger. I so understand the grief and the rage and the desire for liberation, for freedom. I mean, my people, the Americans, fought a revolution over a few paltry taxes on luxury goods. These people had family members butchered in front of them and no rights. They were treated as slaves and second-class citizens. Of course they're angry. And it's amazing to me that Jesus taught those people, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. I try to remember that as often as I can. This wasn't intended to be a sermon, but, you know, there we go. So hopping back in the timeline, I want to just sort of comb through a little bit of what's going on here. One of the things that is very important after Jesus's death and resurrection, and the Holy Spirit fell and the church started to go out to the ends of the earth. So much of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is questions about the kingdom of God and what's Jesus's kingdom going to be like, and who's invited. That's a big question. And then Jesus died and he fulfilled the covenant that started with Abraham in this same historical timeline. He fulfilled that covenant. And so all nations were to be blessed through him. And Jesus made that possible, because now no longer was it go to the Jews and see who God is and see what God is like, and they, as the kingdom of priests, will show you and you can join them. It was, okay, now I'm going to put, the temple had moved from the physical location in Jerusalem, and it had moved, tongues of fire fell on the church, which is the same thing that happened when tongues of fire fell on the temple a long, long time ago. So tongues of fire fell on the church, and then the church was empowered as the presence of God and was ready to go out to the world and proclaim what God had done. The proclamation of the gospel became, and it swept through Rome like wildfire. It is amazing how Christianity changed the world. I find this to be pretty funny. Funny. It's kind of sad. There seems to be a bit of an interest in New Age spirituality and paganism right now, especially kind of on the West Coast and some of the areas. But New Age spirituality is something you'll see it kind of, it's woven into a lot of different things. And if you're confused about the term, you can Google it and you can see it's a whole deal. But it's this sense that we have today that pagans were these happy people who are super spiritual and super like happy and joyful. And the idea that Christianity is this dark and ascetic religion that forces you to, restrict yourself to this super strict morals that no one can really keep. And so Christianity is this dull and dreary and boring thing filled with rituals and taking communion and singing and all this boring stuff that we don't want to do anyways. But the pagans were happy and free and joyful and all of these things. The ironic thing is that doesn't just hold up to historical cross-examination, because over the period of 100 to 300, over half of the Roman Empire voluntarily converted to Christianity. They saw what the pagan gods and the freedom that they had, and they chose the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who showed us his son, Jesus Christ. There was a guy who was arguing with one of the early Christian fathers by the name of Origen, and he derided Christianity as a religion of women and slaves. And so the women and the slaves, the most oppressed groups of all of the people in the Roman hierarchical order, were the ones who were flocking to Jesus most. And so Christianity swept through the Roman world like wildfire. And it started in this area. This is where it all began. And just kind of hopping through, Paul doing all of his missionary journeys, setting up little Christian outposts in each of these cities. And then eventually others picking up the course and carrying it on into where we are today. And this, I don't have enough time to go throughout the whole of church history. And frankly, my knowledge of the Middle Ages is just not good enough to be able to give you any sort of good justice. I need to grow in that area. But I do know that this period of history is where Judaism, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is translated into this Hellenistic and Roman world. Paul is a brilliant missionary, and you see all throughout his letters him you can tell that he is just so schooled and understands who God is, but he also understands who these Romans were and who these Greeks were. And he understood that he needed to explain the concepts of God to them in language that they understand. So he taps into these philosophical concepts, abstract reasoning and logic, and these various things that we're very familiar with, even if we don't know we are. And he explains God to them in ways that they understand. And that's kind of how he started this whole thing off. And then we have John, who is this great mystic who's teaching a lot of people in Asia. When he sees, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation, this has 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation. They're definitely some of the later books that are written. 90 is a decent date for it. Some people would put it later, some earlier. Also, I just want you to hear from me. There is, debate over, is the John of the Gospels the same as the first, second, and third John? Is that the same as the John of Revelation? The fact of the matter is that or different people argue different ways. I am fairly convinced that the Gospel of John and first, second, and third John are written by the same person. They just read very similarly, and it's the same concepts. Light and darkness appear. The way that the word choices that are used, kind of the phraseology, just the feel of it is very similar. I'm almost convinced of that. John of Patmos, it doesn't tell us that it is the same John. It says that John was an elder of the church and he was exiled to an Isle of Patmos. John is a very common name at this time. It's one of the most common names. So it's very likely that it's someone else. I don't care either way. I'm fairly agnostic on the question of, is this John the same one? There's nothing that hinges on that. So I would probably go and say, yeah, it's probably a different person, but I'm fine if you think it's the same person. It doesn't, to me, it's not all that important. Quick deal. This covers where the Gospels, what the Gospels cover. It doesn't quite cover when they were written. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, were almost certainly written. I guess I can't say almost certainly. Again, the theory is that they were probably written somewhere around 60 or sometime before 70. We think that that's the case, particularly us who believe that prophecy is possible. If you don't believe prophecy is possible, then you will place them after 70, because Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. And if Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and you're like, prophecy is impossible, there is no way that God can make someone see something, or God doesn't exist, so prophecy is impossible, it has to be, then you have to date the Gospels later than 70. If you think that prophecy is a possibility, then you say that, well, they're very much, it could have been written before. I think that based on the way that they're written and the tone that they're written with, actually, what am I basing this on? I am basing this on smarter biblical scholars than me who say this. And the people who I trust place them somewhere in the 60s. Some of them place them a little bit later. It's not a test of faith as to when these things were written. Again, it doesn't provide dates in the Bible, so I'm not going to fight it one way or the other. The idea is that when you have the apostles who are living and telling the stories, you don't need them written down. But once you get to 60, you get to the point to where these disciples of Jesus, the people who knew him, were starting to die off. They were being martyred, but they were also starting to just get old. And so because of that, you needed to record this for posterity's sake. And so that is what kind of triggered the collection, compiling, and writing of the gospel accounts. It makes perfect sense to me that that's where it would go. John's gospel is almost certainly written much later. It's just the way that it's written. One of the people I like who said it's the product of deep reflection on these events. And I think that John was written by an eyewitness. I think it is the John who was with Jesus. Mark is attributed to John Mark, Peter's translator, who's mentioned in Acts. There is no textual evidence that leads us to that. It's church tradition. So take that as you will. Matthew is attributed to Matthew or Levi, the tax collector. Again, there's no real internal evidence that forces us to believe that, or it's church tradition as well. And Luke is the one that is autographed, and it said, "Hey, I'm Luke, and I'm writing this to you, most honorable Theophilus." And so Luke is the one who we know, yeah, this was written by Luke. And Luke was not an eyewitness, but he did carefully compile, and he knew all the people, and he wrote it all down. But John, I think, was written by an eyewitness. The disciple whom Jesus loved is John, I believe. And we think he wrote it much, much later. At the end of John's gospel, he talks about how Jesus said that, people mistakenly thought that Jesus told John that he would live forever, it's kind of a hint of, maybe he's got really old. So the idea is that John was pretty young when Jesus first started his ministry around here, and that he lived a very long time, so up maybe even till 90. So he would have been an old man at that time. Okay. as far as the development of Christianity goes, um, that is probably something that requires a little bit further detail and study. This is just a sort of sketch through what's going on. The Roman world at this time, Rome was supreme. They were at the near the height of their power because Caesar Augustus was one of the best emperor, the best of all of the emperors, and he created this system. And he died around 10 BC, or maybe it was 15. And then Tiberius took over, and Tiberius was Caesar. While Jesus was alive. And then after Tiberius, who was after Tiberius? I believe no, because Tiberius had an heir, was Claudius. Yeah, Claudius was in the 50s. Wow, I should have gotten all this out and gotten it together, but no matter. Tiberius was the emperor who put Pontius Pilate in charge, and then he eventually recalled and executed him. Pontius Pilate was not good at his job, not at all. He comes off as very sympathetic in the Gospels, but what we have from Josephus is that he was very bad at his job, and he got recalled for being incompetent and killing a bunch of people for no reason. So when the Romans think you killed people for no reason, you know you've gone bad. Let me just make one comment on historical sources, and then I'm just going to wrap up for today. I don't want to go another 50 minutes like I did last time, and I've probably already gone too long. Josephus is someone who we have to talk about. We were gifted, I'm sure God ordained it, with a very, very, very comprehensive, detailed explanation of all of this period of time by a source called a man named Josephus. Josephus, during this revolt in AD 70, started as a guerrilla fighter, and he was a very successful general. Now, we're not 100% certain because Josephus is the one who wrote the history, so he claimed that he was very good at his job, but he got trapped in a cellar, and he was about to get captured by the Romans during their little revolt here, the Great Jewish Revolt, and he got trapped. And as he got trapped, he hid in a cellar with some of his men, and they were all going to kill themselves, or they were going to kill each other, and then one was going to kill himself. And Josephus let that happen, but then he didn't kill himself. And then Josephus climbed out of the little cellar, and he went to Vespasian, who was the general at the time, who eventually would become the emperor. And then his son Titus would reign after him, and Titus was not good. Vespasian was okay-ish. But Vespasian, what's his face? Josephus says, there's a prophecy in my Bible, in the book of Daniel, and it talks about a great statue with gold and then bronze, and it has feet, and then a rock that's going to claim the whole world. And you are that rock, and you are going to be the emperor. Josephus made a prediction that Vespasian would be emperor. And Josephus turned out to be right. And Vespasian remembered it, and he made him an adopted son. And he became Flavius Josephus. And so Josephus was a traitor to his people. He swapped sides, and he survived. And then he watched as Rome dismantled the rest of the Jewish revolt. And then he went back to Rome. He went to Rome because all his people hated him. And he wrote a history of the Jewish people. And then he wrote a volume called The Jewish Wars. And that gives us so much data. Now, he, in his history, was trying to pin the whole thing. He was trying to justify the Jewish people and try to explain to the Romans why the Jews weren't bad, and it was really just the fault of the Zealots. And Romans understand, freedom fighters, they get that impulse, even if they lost. And so he was trying to pin it all on them and say, and sort of put his people in a good light and justify all that. So there's definitely an angle to his history, but it provides a very good resource that tells us a lot of stuff about what was going on in the world of Jesus. And so that's where a lot of our history comes from, a lot of the Roman history, as well as a lot of the kind of biblical history stuff. So really important source. It's very dry read. If you want to take it on, I understand, but you need a commentary because he mentions a lot of things that, boy, oh boy, I don't understand. It's like a bunch of names and stuff, and you're like, oh gosh, I can get lost in this. So imagine reading Numbers, but much longer. Anyways, important stuff. Really enjoy this history stuff. I think there's a lot of times where it provides helpful knowledge for us as a people, and us as the people of God trying to learn about the Word of God. And if you have any questions or want my timelines or any of the slides or anything like that, shoot me an email, zach@amchurch.net. Really glad to get to share this with you. You guys have a blessed morning and enjoy service.